Phoenix City Council is taking major steps to limit the production of methamphetamines. We'll hear from Arizona's Attorney General and others. And a major Phoenix shopping center is undergoing a big revitalization. I'm Councilman Dave Siebert, and that's coming up next on The Issues. Welcome to On the Issues. I'm City Councilman Dave Siebert. The drug, crystal methamphetamine, has been a big criminal and public safety problem in Phoenix and all around the country. The City Council is working to help cut the production of this dangerous drug. Joining me to talk about this today are my colleague, District 4 Councilman Tom Simplot, Arizona Attorney General Terry Goddard, and Sergeant Don Sherrard, who heads the Phoenix Police Lab that deals with meth. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. Mr. Attorney General.
Sure.
We spent a lot of time working with you on some state legislation last year that unfortunately didn't make it through the process. Let's talk about the ideas of where you think we need to go to really make a dent in this terrible product that is just killing many of our children and even the adults, and just ruining the quality of life that we have in this community.
It's true, and I want to congratulate the Phoenix City Council and you, Councilman, for the leadership in taking this debate to another level, to taking action on trying to stop the scourge of methamphetamines, at least within the city of Phoenix. And I think it's a leadership that is going to be followed by other cities and towns across Arizona. Unfortunately, the legislature didn't get the message, or didn't get the full message, and that is that pseudo-ephedrine is what is so easily made into methamphetamine, and it kills people. It maims them, it destroys their lives, it literally causes irreversible brain damage in the folks that use it excessively, and it's highly, highly addictive, perhaps the most addictive drug that we know of out there. So this is a major problem, as you said. Law enforcement across the country has declared this to be the most serious law enforcement issue that they have to deal with. And I think one of the reasons for that is illegal drugs are all serious problems for law enforcement, but this is one that has so many ramifications, because when they cook it in the house, and that's the problem that the Phoenix City Council is taking strong action against, it literally poisons the neighborhood, it poisons the house, it poisons any kids that may happen to be unfortunate enough to be raised in that environment through no fault of their own. It produces extraordinary amounts of toxic waste. And for first responders, police and fire, who stumble upon or are doing something else, fighting a fire, serving a warrant, somehow on the premises, not knowing it's a meth lab, their lives could be in danger. And unfortunately, many first responders have in fact been seriously injured or killed because they came into a meth lab without knowing what was behind those walls. And they exploded or they inhaled poisonous vapors. And this has got to stop.
Councilman Simplot, you and I had the chance to co-chair a task force. Why don't you talk about that and talk about all the great people that really took time out of their busy schedules to talk about this terrible problem?
Well, and you know, we worked this summer, tremendous support from the community, the Chamber of Commerce, community leaders, the homeless community. So many different members and leaders of our community came together and agreed on one thing, and that was Phoenix needs to take the lead on passing these ordinances. The group also believed that, as you have said repeatedly, Councilman Siebert, this isn't the right approach. And unfortunately, it has fallen in our lap to take this approach because the state legislature didn't. This should be a statewide approach. But instead, we're being forced to do it on a local and a regional basis. And so that's what we're going to do.
Why don't you talk a little bit about the dentist that was giving us some testimony from the task force and the problems he has serving the people at Cass?
The after effects of crystal meth abuse are horrible. Over 90% of the folks that the Cass, the homeless shelter dental clinic, actually serves, over 90% are the result of crystal meth. Literally 20 and 21-year-olds whose teeth are falling out, the enamels are falling off because of crystal meth.
Isn't the enamel the hardest substance in the body?
It is.
And it's actually deteriorating their teeth, and they're
is.
getting full extractions
That's right.
and dentures at the age of 20 and 21 years old.
That's right.
Sergeant, let's talk about labs. You know, you go into these labs, you wear the SCBAs to go in. Tell us what you're finding when you go in there.
deplorable conditions, first and foremost. And when we find children in there, and vulnerable adults too, because we've seized labs where grandson has moved in to help grandma or grandpa, and they set up the cook, and these people are just as helpless and are exposed to these chemicals also. But we are in these awful places that have chemical contamination in the furniture, in the food, in the clothing. It's just in everything that we encounter in these places. They're common everyday household chemicals, but as we know, they all have warning labels on them, and now they're mixing these things together, and we don't have any idea what that's going to do to a human being. If we look at these pictures, we see the staining on the countertops, in the carpets. Common household chemicals, glassware, mason jars, things that we expect to find in homes, but not to be twisted and used in this manner. A lot of violence. These people are very paranoid. We see the guns, we see knives, improvised weapons. Here's a guy that this particular one had an elderly woman downstairs, couldn't get upstairs, and she had no idea what he was doing, but she was being exposed. The kids, we have an ion scanner, we test their toys, we test the crib rails, and we test the strollers, and we find that they're contaminated with methamphetamine. So there's no way that these kids are not being exposed, even if the parents use the excuses that, well, we don't smoke around the children, or we smoke in this room. We test the air vents, and we find methamphetamine, throughout the houses.
It's amazing. Let me just follow up on the impact the Sergeant has referred to on children. The Attorney General's office handles all of the cases for dependency and parental rights severance that Child Protective Services handles in the state of Arizona. And so most of the worst cases of child abuse come to us. And the result of an informal poll just a little while ago, when we asked what was this was based on a legislative inquiry. They said, is drug abuse ever involved, or are drugs ever involved in child abuse? And I thought first they were joking, and then we went back and did a survey. And the answer, of course, is, of course, drugs are involved in about 80% of the child abuse situations that go to the ultimate route through dependency, first taking the kids out of the home and then ultimately severing parental rights. But according to our reports, methamphetamines are the primary drug leading to violence against children in about 65 to 70% of all the child abuse cases that we handle. So meth is there whenever kids, or women for that matter, are being abused. The chances are very high that meth is what's in the background. And
could you repeat those numbers in case somebody missed?
Okay, we do all the child abuse cases that Child Protective Services handles. We take them through the courts, and 65% minimum named methamphetamines as being the cause of the abuse, being the underlying drug abuse that was, and about 80 said drugs were involved. So meth could have been in a greater number, it just wasn't specified in the report. In addition, what the sergeant just said is so true. I mean, somewhere meth users, either they lose all their common sense or they just don't want to care for their children because by cooking, they put all these toxic vapors, the phosphine gas, the meth itself, the iodine vapors, all diffuse throughout the property, so that a child in another room is getting a lethal dose of many toxic chemicals because somebody's cooking in the room next door. So it's not just when you smoke in the presence of a child. The act of making methamphetamines is child abuse under Arizona law per se. And we prosecuted and found, well, let me think. In the last 4 years, there have been about 400 children that we've taken out of meth labs throughout the state. I believe, unfortunately, that's only a fraction of the number of kids that are actually exposed to meth cooks.
The state did strengthen the penalties for people who are cooking meth around children, but the problem, and maybe Sergeant will ask you this question, is there any indication that people really care, who are cooking meth, really care what the penalty is? I mean, do they even rationally think of that as in their thought process or lack thereof?
It's interesting, when we are working up a case, we will watch these locations, we'll watch the people, and the way that they treat their children when they don't know that we're looking and when we get there is 180 degrees difference, because obviously once we're there, then that's all they're concerned about is their children. You can't take them away from their kids. Please don't take my kids away from me. But there is just absolutely no regard for the children when we watch them and they don't know
So
that we're on
the
the
penalty change in the law is not going to cut back on meth labs?
I don't think it would. Obviously, it will take that person off the street, but if we can take that pseudo-ephedrine away from them so that they can't be making it at all, that's where we're going to make the most ground, and then we can come back and start working on the rest of it.
And our observation in all the testimony of people who are using meth, and meth cooks, I guess 99% of the time are also meth users, they think they're supermen and women. They don't relate to the legal system. You could tell them the penalty was 100 years, and I don't think once they're involved in this mentality that's going to affect them at all. So yes, the sergeant makes a good point. That may, once they're arrested, that may take them away, but is it going to deter them in the first place from endangering their kids and their neighbors and the whole community? I don't think so, and unfortunately, we have a lot of evidence that it won't. Oklahoma first did the penalty, and they found it had minimal impact upon the large number of labs in their state. Then they did what you've just passed, which is the restrictions on getting pseudoephedrine, putting it behind the counter, making sure that anybody who wants to buy quantities has to sign a log and show identification. Then the incidence of methamphetamine labs in Oklahoma went down by 70%. 70% in the first month. They maintained that average. The bill was passed about 1.5 years ago. They maintained the average ever since. And what I just find astonishing is why anybody, any legislator, any councilman, would see that kind of number and not want to have it for their community.
Well, I was just going to ask you, what numbers did it pass by?
Well, in Oklahoma, tragically, it was motivated by the death of 3 police officers as a result of methamphetamine violence. And it went through, I'm not saying easily, since it was the first in the nation of its kind, but it passed overwhelmingly. And then subsequently, after Oklahoma was able to show this kind of success, 12 other states basically rolled up in fast succession to pass the same kind of restrictions. And they, at one point, I remember I was keeping score, the legislative vote was like 590 to 4. It was just overwhelming. 4 states in a row, in 1 week's time, passed it unanimously. So this isn't a partisan issue. This isn't something that you can say Democrats are on one side, Republicans on the other, independents somewhere else. People who care about their communities have been overwhelmingly in support of this kind of very rational regulation. It just has to come.
It's a community issue, and Tom, I know you and I went to a funeral recently of Officer David Uribe, and was one of the officers killed in my district in the line of duty, and he was doing a traffic stop on people that were running methamphetamine. And then a few years earlier, we had Officer Jolet Buff, who was chasing down a meth suspect and was run over by a 18-wheeler. He was also killed in my district. And for people to say that we don't have any public safety officials getting hurt or killed is a misstatement. It's 2 very terrible tragedies that occurred, and had methamphetamine not been out there, those 2 officers would still be alive.
And there was a deputy sheriff in Pinal County that was killed as a result of a meth raid. It's not, unfortunately, it's not isolated in Arizona. Sometimes it's hard to tell that it was meth that was the precipitator, because the police report may involve, in the case of Officer Uribe, there's no question both of the suspects in that case, my understanding, were using meth and were in that violent stage after you've had a meth high, when you're paranoid and frankly you tend to shoot everything that moves if you've got a gun. That's an aspect of meth use that we find particularly dangerous for law enforcement, is that these people after a sustained high go into a period of just manic paranoia. And they're not themselves. One of the points that I hear over and over again is, you may think you know the person who's a meth user, but when they're on meth, they're somebody else completely, and they will do things that the individual, when they're sober, would never consider doing.
Don't we actually have tremendous support from our law enforcement agencies across the state for this sort of legislation?
Absolutely.
And the ordinance that we have passed here at the city?
All but one of the sheriffs, all but one of the county attorneys have been supportive, and vigorously so. And again, that's across party lines. Every association of law enforcement officers has been supportive of the Oklahoma-style legislation, what the city of Phoenix considered and passed. But it goes so far beyond that. Mental health professionals, because they think this is going to help people that have unfortunately fallen into drug use and are on the street. Teachers. They believe that we, unfortunately, in Arizona, are the highest meth users in the age group between 12 and 19. So unfortunately, many teachers see the effects of this drug in their classroom.
Councilman, let's talk about specifics of the ordinance that we passed. We have two different ordinances. You want to talk about those?
Well, as we all know at this table, the first ordinance would require that pseudo-ephedrine containing products, in other words, Sudafed, any of the other products with any pseudo-ephedrine at all, would be placed behind the counter. Our ordinance also requires that if the retailer does not put those products behind the counter, that the police can seize those products. And after going through a legal battle, maybe the retailer will get them back. But the fact is, I believe we're the first in the country, is that true? That will allow the police to seize those products that are not behind the counter.
They give
Some
a
needed muscle behind the provision.
and they give a warning the first time.
That's right.
It's a Class 1 misdemeanor. Second time they come back, they can seize the product.
That's right.
And the second ordinance actually requires a database.
That's right. That's the log, the identification in the log, which of course is the Oklahoma model.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's had such a dramatic effect across the country is apparently just that extra step of requiring you show a log, show identification, sign a log, is something that the meth users, the meth cooks, don't want to do under any circumstances, and it deters them. It keeps them out of the product, getting the product and then cooking it.
Well, right now what they're doing under the current state laws is they'll go out to a store, a few of them get together, they'll buy the maximum amount of pseudo-ephedrine product they can buy, then they just make the circuit. Mm-hmm. Next day they come back and they keep doing it, and with
that's not illegal, unfortunately, in Arizona law right now. You keep buying 9 grams wherever you stop, and you can accumulate a tremendous amount. They even have a word for it. It's smurfing.
Right. Is there any legitimate use for that amount of pseudo-ephedrine products?
Well, I've asked doctors, emergency room physicians and nurses all across Arizona that exact question. Is there any reason why any particular individual, any parent, for example, would have to have that kind of a pseudoephedrine need? And the answer is no. There are alternatives on the market. Pfizer, for example, makes Sudafed PE, which is a non-pseudoephedrine-based cold medication.
It does the same thing.
Does the same thing, and I predict that virtually all the other manufacturers, if there's sufficient pressure, such as Phoenix has just applied, they're going to start going to alternatives. You don't have to go to that cold medicine. But even if you do, I've had people who have emphysema and other very serious lung problems where congestion is almost life-threatening, and they say, "Look, I know this is such a severe problem that I'm willing to put up with some minor discomfort in order to solve it, and it doesn't matter to me that I have to show some identification. For heaven's sakes, if I get a prescription, I've got to show 20 different kinds of identification and compare all of it with a huge database that the drugstores have already." So it's not like you're requiring some tremendous new impediment that'll keep people who need cold medication from getting it. The other thing is 9 grams of pseudoephedrine is about 800 to 900 tablets.
That's a lot of tablets.
More 200 to 300 tablets.
But it's more than what you can possibly use.
This is the worst cold in creation. So
right.
You really don't need that many tablets at one time. And there's such a big difference between the person who buys 1 blister pack and keeps it in their medicine cabinet, and somebody who just is going from store to store to store buying the maximum. Now, there's no question in my mind that person does not have a bad cold.
Mr. Attorney General, I want to thank you for all the work that you've done and your passion for this issue. Again, Councilman, you and I put a lot of work into this. I appreciate all the work you've done.
Thank you for your leadership.
Sergeant, thank you. Tell your guys we really appreciate all the work they do. They're the ones that have to go in with the SCBAs and go into that toxic mess. So thank you for everything you do.